History tells us that enslaved people were powerless, that once chains were locked around their wrists, hope died with them. But what if that history was incomplete? What if one enslaved boy did break, but instead became a hunter? Tonight, you will hear a story erased from textbooks. The story of a 16-year-old Kongo warrior who turned the terror of the slave trade back onto those who created it. This is not a legend. This is not a myth. This is the untold revenge of Domingo. Before we get started, tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a chilling story. Long before chains touched his skin, before foreign languages replaced the sound of home, and before the ocean learned his name, Domingo belonged to a world that moved with purpose. The kingdom of Kongo was not a land of chaos, as later narratives would falsely claim, but a structured civilization shaped by memory, honor, and survival. Villages were not merely collections of huts, but living communities bound by ancestry, ritual, and responsibility. The earth beneath Domingo's feet was not dirt, it was inheritance. Every path had been walked by those before him, every tree carried stories whispered through generations, and every sunrise reminded the people of Kongo that they were still standing because their ancestors had endured worse. Domingo grew up inside that understanding. From the moment he could walk, he was taught that life was not something to waste, because it had already been paid for in blood long before he was born. As a boy, Domingo did not wake to silence. He woke to the sound of life moving, goats stirring, women preparing fires, elders speaking softly while watching the horizon, and the rhythmic pounding of tools against wood and stone. Mornings carried the smell of smoke and earth, and the air itself felt alive, heavy with humidity and promise. Children were not shielded from reality here. They watched hunts, they learned which plants healed and which killed, and they listened when the elders spoke of war, of betrayal, of outsiders who did not come with peace. These were not stories meant to frighten them. They were warnings meant to prepare them. Domingo listened carefully, more carefully than most. There was something about the way the elders spoke, slow, deliberate, never rushed, that made him understand that survival was not accidental. It was learned. By the time Domingo reached his 16th year, he was no longer considered a child. In the kingdom of Kongo, age was less important than readiness. And Domingo was ready. His body had been shaped by labor and discipline, his hands calloused from training, his legs strong from running through forests that swallowed the unprepared whole. He had learned how to read the land in ways that words could not explain, how broken leaves could reveal pursuit, how birds could signal danger, how silence itself could mean death was nearby. He trained with older boys and men who bore scars not as symbols of weakness, but as proof of survival. Each scar told a story, and Domingo understood that one day, if he lived long enough, his own body would speak for him. But despite all this preparation, despite the wisdom passed down, and the warnings repeated year after year, there was one truth no one could fully explain to him. No one could prepare him for the cruelty that did not seek land or victory, but ownership. The elders spoke of outsiders, pale-skinned men with weapons that roared like thunder, men who traded human beings as if they were livestock. They spoke of raids, of disappearing villages, of ships that swallowed people and never returned them. But these stories felt distant to Domingo, like shadows at the edge of the firelight. He believed, as many young warriors do, that skill and courage could protect him from anything. That belief was not arrogance, it was youth. And youth, in every culture, carries the dangerous illusion of time. Domingo's days followed a rhythm shaped by tradition. At dawn, he trained. At midday, he worked alongside his people. In the evenings, he listened. He listened to the drums that carried messages across distance, to the songs that preserved memory, and to the elders who reminded the young warriors that strength without discipline was useless. Domingo respected those lessons deeply. He was not reckless. He did not seek unnecessary conflict. He understood that a true warrior did not fight for glory but for protection. His role was not to conquer, but to defend what already existed. That sense of duty anchored him. It gave him identity. It gave him pride. There were moments, however, when Domingo felt something else stirring beneath that pride, curiosity mixed with unease. Sometimes traders passed near the edges of their territory, bringing foreign goods in exchange for ivory or palm oil. Sometimes they brought stories of lands beyond the horizon, of weapons that could kill from a distance, of ships so large they seemed to eat the sea itself. Domingo listened to these stories with a quiet intensity. He noticed how the elders grew tense when these traders spoke, how conversations
Move! The light is
ended
fading!
abruptly,
We can't keep this
followed
pace!
the strangers
You must!
until
We're
they
almost there!
disappeared from sight. Even as a boy, Domingo understood that danger did not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrived smiling. The night before everything changed was unremarkable. That was the cruelest part. There were no omens carved into the sky, no sudden silence of birds, no sense of impending doom that might have given Domingo time to prepare. The village ate together. Children laughed. Fires burned low as the elders spoke of mundane concerns, harvests, repairs, the coming rains. Domingo sat among them, sharpening his spear, listening more than he spoke. He remembers that night not because something terrible happened, but because nothing did. It was peace in its purest form, and peace, as history has proven time and again, is often the last thing stolen. When Domingo lay down to sleep, the sounds of the forest wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. Insects sang their endless chorus. The earth breathed beneath him. He did not know that this would be the last night he would sleep as a free person. He did not know that by the next sunrise, his name would begin to disappear. History rarely warns its victims. It simply arrives. The attack came before dawn, when vigilance is weakest and fear travels fastest. There was no single moment when danger announced itself. It began with a scream cut short, sharp, final. Then another. Fire followed sound, and sound followed chaos. Domingo woke to shouting, to the smell of smoke thick enough to choke breath, to the unmistakable thunder of weapons he had only heard described. He moved on instinct, grabbing his spear, his heart pounding not with fear but with confusion. This was not how war was supposed to begin. There was no challenge issued, no warning drums, no time to form defense. This was not battle. This was slaughter. Men poured into the village from all sides, some familiar in form, others terrifyingly foreign. They moved with coordination, not hesitation. Torches were thrown onto roofs. Gunshots shattered the air, louder than anything Domingo had ever heard. People fell without understanding why. Mothers screamed for children. Children screamed for mothers. Domingo saw an elder try to reason with one of the attackers and watched him die mid-sentence. That image would never leave him. Words, he learned in that moment, held no value to those who came only to take. Domingo fought. He did not freeze. He did not hide. He did what he had been trained to do. He struck one man down with his spear, the shock of real combat surging through him like fire. But courage alone could not overcome numbers, weapons, and betrayal. A blow from behind sent him crashing to the ground. The world spun. He tasted blood. Hands grabbed him rough, merciless hands that treated his body not as human but as cargo. Iron closed around his wrists. The cold bite of metal burned into his skin, heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. As he was dragged away from the burning remains of his village, Domingo looked back. He searched for faces he knew, for signs of survival, for anything that made sense. He found none. Smoke swallowed everything. The songs, the stories, the morning routines, all of it vanished behind him. In that moment, something inside Domingo fractured. Not his spirit, not his will. Something deeper, his understanding of the world itself. The rules he had lived by no longer applied. Honor had not protected them. Strength had not been enough. Preparation had failed. But even as despair crept in, another feeling rose alongside it, something cold, something focused. Domingo did not cry out. He did not beg. He memorized faces, voices, movements. He memorized the weight of the chains, the way the attackers spoke to one another, the direction they traveled. This was not conscious strategy. It was survival instinct sharpening into something dangerous. The boy who had trained to defend his people was being forced into a world where defense was no longer possible. And in that world, only one option remained. By the time the sun rose, Domingo was no longer a son of the Kingdom of Kongo. On paper, in ledgers written by men who would never know his language or his past, he would become something else entirely. A number. A commodity, a profit. But inside his mind, inside the part of him that still remembered the forest and the drums and the elders, warnings, a promise began to form. It was not spoken aloud. It did not need to be. It was simple and it was absolute. If he survived what was coming next, the world would one day remember his pain, and it would answer for it. The march away from the village did not begin with distance, but with disbelief. Domingo, his feet moved because they were forced to, not because his mind had accepted what was happening. The ground beneath him still felt familiar, the same soil he had trained on, the same paths he had walked countless times, but nothing else made sense anymore. Smoke followed them like a living thing, crawling into the sky, marking the place where his life had been severed. The sounds behind him faded slowly, screams thinning into sobs, sobs into silence, silence into the crackling of fire consuming what little remained. Domingo turned his head only once, just enough to see the glow of his village dissolving into ash. That single glance would haunt him longer than any wound. It was the last time he would see the place that had given him a name. The chains around his wrists were not merely restraints, they were declarations. Every step they took, the iron clinked together, a rhythmic reminder that the world now measured him by weight, not worth. The men who marched them forward spoke in languages Domingo did not fully understand, but he understood their tone well enough. There was no urgency in their voices, no fear. This was routine for them. That realization cut deeper than the metal ever could. To Domingo, this was the end of everything he knew. To then it was another successful night. As the group moved deeper into unfamiliar territory, more captives joined the line, men, women, children, some injured, some barely conscious. Domingo watched them closely. He recognized the look in their eyes, shock, confusion, terror. Some cried openly, their voices breaking against the indifference of their captors. Others stared ahead in silence, already retreating into themselves. Domingo did neither. He walked with his jaw clenched, his breathing controlled. The training of a warrior did not disappear just because his hands were bound. His body remembered discipline even as his world collapsed. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time lost its shape. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but thirst was worse. The guards offered nothing unless it served their convenience. Anyone who stumbled was beaten. Anyone who resisted was punished publicly. Domingo saw one man fall to his knees, unable to continue. He saw the hesitation flicker across a guard, as face not mercy, but calculation before the man was struck down and left where he fell. The march did not slow. Life, Domingo learned, had become disposable. Eventually, the forest thinned and the air changed. The scent of salt crept into his lungs, unfamiliar and unsettling. When Domingo saw the water for the first time, his steps faltered. He had heard stories of the ocean, but no story had prepared him for its vastness. It stretched endlessly, swallowing the horizon, indifferent and enormous. Along its edge waited something even more terrifying: ships. Massive wooden structures loomed like beasts at rest, their dark hulls cutting into the water. Domingo's heart pounded harder than it had during the raid. This was not a place meant for people. This was a place meant for disappearance. The process that followed was not chaotic. It was methodical. Captives were sorted, inspected, prodded like animals. Domingo felt hands on his body, assessing muscle, teeth, strength. He felt rage burn in his chest, hot and dangerous, but he forced it down. Anger without action was useless. He remembered the elders. Words survive first. Everything else comes later. So he endured. He lowered his gaze. He did not react. He became still. When he was finally pushed toward the ship, the sounds changed again. The ocean groaned against the wood. Chains echoed below deck. The smell hit him first: rot, waste, sickness, despair, all trapped in an enclosed space that breathed death. As Domingo descended into the belly of the ship, the light disappeared. Darkness closed in, thick and suffocating. Bodies were already packed together, lying on planks slick with sweat and blood. There was no room to sit upright, no room to turn, no room to exist with dignity. The hatch closed above them, sealing the darkness. Panic erupted. Cries rose from every corner. Some prayed in languages Domingo did not recognize. Others cursed. Others screamed until their voices broke. Domingo lay still, pressed between strangers, his breath shallow. The air was thin, heavy with heat. Every inhale tasted of decay. This was not transport. This was deliberate suffering. Days blended into nights, though there was no way to tell them apart. The ship moved, rocking violently, tossing bodies against one another. Sickness spread quickly. Vomit, blood, waste all mixed together. Those who grew too weak were sometimes dragged out, sometimes never returned. Domingo watched everything. He watched men lose their minds, tearing at their chains until their skins split. He watched others go silent, their eyes empty, their bodies alive but already gone. He learned quickly that despair was contagious. He refused to let it take him. Instead, he listened. He learned the sounds of the ship, the creak of the boards, the rhythm of footsteps above, the timing of when food was lowered. He learned which guards were careless, which were cruel, which were bored. His mind remained active even as his body suffered. The warrior within him adapted to a new battlefield. There would be no spears here, no direct combat. Survival itself became resistance. At night, if night could even be defined in that darkness, Domingo closed his eyes and forced himself to remember. He remembered the sound of drums echoing through the forest. He remembered the feel of earth beneath his bare feet. He remembered his name. He repeated it silently, over and over, afraid that if he did not, it would disappear. Names mattered. Names were proof of existence. The men above deck would try to erase it, replace it with something easier to pronounce, easier to sell. Domingo refused to let that happen inside his mind. Storms battered the ship without warning. Waves crashed over the deck, water seeping down into the hold. The screams grew louder during those moments, fear amplified by the sense that the ocean itself wanted them gone. Domingo felt the ship lurch violently, wood groaning under pressure. For a brief moment he wondered if death by drowning would be kinder than whatever awaited them on the other side. Then he pushed the thought away. Death was not an escape. Survival was the only weapon he had left. Somewhere along the crossing, Domingo stopped thinking of himself as a boy. Pain aged him rapidly. Loss hardened him. Each death around him reinforced the truth the elders had tried to teach. The world could be cruel beyond imagination, but cruelty did not eliminate responsibility. If he lived, then his survival would have meaning. That belief anchored him when his body threatened to give up. When land finally appeared, it was not greeted with relief. It was greeted with dread. The ship slowed. Voices above deck grew louder. The hatch opened, flooding the hold with blinding light. Domingo squinted, his eyes burning. One by one, captives were dragged out, some unable to walk, some carried like sacks. Domingo forced himself upright, despite the pain shooting through his limbs. Weakness invited punishment. He had learned that much already. As he stepped onto foreign soil, the heat struck him first, heavy and suffocating in a different way. This land smelled wrong. It did not carry the familiarity of home. The air felt hostile. Men waited onshore, examining the captives with cold efficiency. Domingo understood now that the journey had only been the beginning. Whatever awaited him here would be designed to break what little remained. He was renamed within hours. His original name given by his family, tied to lineage, and meaning was dismissed as irrelevant. They called him Domingo because it was easier, because it fit their records, because it stripped away everything he had been before. Domingo accepted the name outwardly, but inwardly he held on to the truth. A name forced upon you does not erase the one you were born with. It only reveals the intentions of those who give it. That night, as he lay on the hard ground of a place he did not recognize, Domingo stared up at an unfamiliar sky. The stars were wrong. The constellations he knew were missing, replaced by patterns that meant nothing to him. The realization hit him harder than any blow. He was truly alone. Everything that had defined him, land, people, tradition, was gone. There would be no rescue, no return. The only path forward ran straight through suffering. But even in that moment of isolation, something inside him refused to die. The same instinct that had driven him to memorize faces during the raid, to observe during the crossing, to endure without surrender, it was still there, quiet, patient, dangerous. Domingo did not know how or when, but he knew this much. If the world had decided to make him a victim, it had chosen the wrong boy. The night everything was taken did not end when the village burned. It continued across the ocean, across the renaming, across the stripping away of identity. It continued inside Domingo. His mind, reshaping him into something harder, something colder, something far more lethal than the boy who had once trained beneath the trees of Kongo. What the hunters and traders could not understand, what history would fail to record, was that they had not just enslaved the village. They had forged a survival. And the survivors remember. The first morning on that foreign shore did not feel like arrival. It felt like burial. Domingo awoke not to freedom or clarity, but to commands shouted in harsh, unfamiliar tongues, and the sharp sting of pain as men were forced to stand before their bodies were ready. Muscles, cramped from weeks of confinement, screamed in protest, but protest had no place here. Anyone who moved too slowly was struck. Anyone who collapsed was dragged. Domingo rose because he understood something vital now. Movement, even forced movement, meant life. Stillness invited disappearance. He steadied himself on trembling legs, his head pounding, his mouth dry beyond pain, and followed the line without question, because questions no longer belonged to him. They were herded toward holding pens near the water, fenced enclosures that reeked of fear and sweat. Domingo noticed how the ocean remained visible from every angle, as if to remind them that there was no going back. The water glittered under the sun, beautiful and indifferent, mocking the misery it had just carried across its surface. He remembered the darkness of the ship, the way the waves had crashed like judgment, the way screams had been swallowed by the endless motion. The ocean had not answered them then, and it would not answer them now. It had done its job. It had delivered them. Time fractured in those early days. There was no clear distinction between hours, no rhythm to mark survival. The captives were fed just enough to remain standing, just enough to remain useful. Domingo, his body began to adapt in small, painful ways. Hunger became a constant background noise rather than a sharp agony. His skin hardened where chains rubbed. His senses sharpened, attuned to shifts in tone, posture, and tension. This was not resilience born of comfort. It was resilience born of necessity. He watched others break, some quickly, some slowly, some without sound. He watched hope drain from eyes as reality set in. He did not judge them. He understood too well how heavy the weight of loss could be. Eventually, they were moved again, loaded onto smaller boats, then wagons, then forced to march inland. Each transfer stripped away another layer of certainty. Domingo stopped wondering where they were going. The destination no longer mattered. What mattered was survival within movement, endurance within uncertainty. He memorized terrain as best he could, though everything looked unfamiliar. The trees were wrong, the earth felt wrong, even the insects sounded different. This land did not know him. It had no reason to protect him. When they reached the plantation, Domingo understood immediately that this place was designed not just to extract labor, but to erase resistance. Everything about it spoke of control. The layout forced visibility. The buildings were positioned to watch rather than shelter. The fields stretched endlessly, flat and exposed, offering no hiding places, no cover. Domingo felt something tighten in his chest. A warrior, his instincts recognized a trap long before the mind accepted it. This was a battlefield with no flanks, no retreat. They were divided, assigned roles branded with new routines meant to replace memory. Domingo learned quickly that names were used selectively here. Overseers used them only when necessary, often preferring numbers or commands instead. Language itself became a weapon, confusing, isolating, designed to sever connection between those who might otherwise unite. Domingo listened carefully, learning patterns, absorbing meaning. He did not rush understanding. He had learned on the ship that patience was a form of power. The first days of labor were a test of endurance. The sun burned without mercy, beating down on his back as he worked until his hands bled and his vision blurred. Water was rationed, food was scarce, rest was conditional. Domingo's body screamed for relief, but his mind remained focused. He watched the overseers. Routines, the timing of patrols, the moments when attention drifted. He noted which guards were cruel for pleasure and which were cruel out of obedience. There was a difference, and differences could be exploited. At night, exhaustion wrapped around him like a second set of chains. He lay among others in cramped quarters, the air thick with sweat and despair. Some whispered prayers. Some spoke of escape in hushed tones, though their voices carried more hope than strategy. Domingo listened but did not speak. Escape without preparation was suicide. He had seen enough death already. If he was going to risk his life, it would be for something more than a moment of false freedom. Sleep brought no peace. Dreams dragged him back to the village, the fire, the screams, the moment he was struck down. He woke often, heart racing, jaw clenched, his body tense as if ready to fight. Each morning the reality returned, heavier than before. But instead of crushing him, it forged him. Pain became familiar. Fear became manageable. Rage settled into something colder, more deliberate. Weeks turned into months. Domingo's body changed. His muscles hardened in new ways, shaped by repetitive labor rather than training. He adapted his movements to conserve energy, to minimize punishment. The overseers noticed his strength and assigned him heavier tasks. He accepted them without protest. Strength drew attention, but it also created opportunity. Those trusted with more responsibility often moved more freely, observed less closely. Domingo understood this instinctively. He learned the plantation as rhythms as thoroughly as he had once learned the forestes. He learned when the guards drank, when they argued, when they grew careless. He learned the sounds that signaled danger and those that signaled indifference. He learned which fellow captives could be trusted and which had been broken beyond repair. Trust was dangerous here. Betrayal was rewarded. Domingo kept his circle small, his intentions hidden. There were moments when despair crept close, whispering that resistance was pointless, that survival alone was enough. But then he would remember the march from his village, the ocean-swallowing screams, the casual efficiency of men who sold human beings like goods. He remembered the eyes of those left behind. Survival without meaning felt like surrender. Domingo refused to surrender. One night, as rain hammered the earth and gods sought shelter, Domingo felt something shift. The plantation seemed momentarily vulnerable, its rigid order disrupted by nature, its indifference. He watched as shadows blurred, as routines faltered. The idea of escape flickered not as impulse but as possibility. He did not act then, he was not ready. But the seed was planted. Punishment was inevitable. It always was. One day, a man near Domingo collapsed from exhaustion. Work halted briefly. Overseers shouted. The man was beaten until he no longer moved. Domingo was forced to watch. They wanted fear to spread. They wanted obedience to root itself deep. Domingo felt rage surge through him, hot and uncontrollable. His fists clenched. His breath quickened. For a moment he nearly acted, for a moment he nearly died. He learned something important that day, not about cruelty but about timing. Rage without control was exactly what they expected. It was easy to crush. The kind of resistance that survived had to be quieter, smarter, patient. Domingo swallowed his fury and stored it away, letting it sharpen rather than explode. At night he trained his body in small ways, stretching cramped muscles, practicing controlled breathing. Recalling movements he had learned as a boy, he visualized escape routes even when none existed. Visualization kept his mind active, his spirit intact. He refused to let the plantation define him completely. The ocean remained present in his thoughts. Sometimes he could smell it on the wind, faint but unmistakable. It reminded him of the crossing, of the darkness below deck, of the screams that had vanished into waves. The ocean had taken much from him, but it had also delivered him here alive. That contradiction unsettled him. The ocean was not enemy or ally. It simply was, like history itself. Rumors spread among the captives, whispers of runaways, of maroon communities hidden deep in forests or swamps. Some claimed they were myths, stories told to give false hope. Others swore they were real. Domingo listened carefully. He asked quiet questions. He separated fantasy from possibility. If such places existed, reaching them would require more than desperation. It would require knowledge, strength, and above all, patience. The plantation tried to strip him of patience. Long hours, repetitive labor, constant surveillance, these things were designed to exhaust the mind as much as the body. Domingo countered by turning monotony into observation. Every repeated action revealed a pattern. Every pattern revealed weakness. He learned where tools were stored, where fences were weakest, where sound carried least. He learned how to move without drawing attention, how to make himself unremarkable. Invisibility became his armor. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Domingo caught sight of his reflection in a pool of water. He barely recognized the face staring back. It was older, harder, eyes that had seen too much. The boy from Kongo felt distant, almost unreal, and yet beneath the scars of exhaustion something remained unchanged. The core, the will, the refusal to be owned. The ocean that had swallowed screams had not swallowed him. It had tested him. It had stripped him bare and left him with nothing but himself. And in that emptiness, Domingo had discovered something terrifying, not just for his captors, but for the system that believed it could erase him. He was still here, and as long as he was still here, the story was not over. The crossing had not broken him. It had transformed him. The boy who had left Kongo had died somewhere between the waves and the shore. In his place stood something new, something forged by suffering and sharpened by memory. The plantation did not yet realize it, but it housed not just a laborer, not just a captive, but a survivor who was learning, waiting and preparing. The ocean had swallowed screams, but it had carried vengeance too. The days that followed did not announce themselves with change. There was no moment where Domingo woke and realized he had crossed some invisible threshold. Instead, transformation crept in quietly, shaping him the way water shapes stone, slow, relentless, inevitable. The plantation continued its routine with mechanical precision, each sunrise demanding labor, each sunset offering nothing but exhaustion. To the overseers, Domingo was becoming exactly what they wanted: efficient, silent, productive. To themselves, they congratulated their system. They believed the chains had done their work. They could not see what was happening beneath the surface. Domingo learned quickly that survival here required more than strength. Strength alone attracted attention, and attention invited punishment. He adjusted the way he carried himself, dulling his presence just enough to fade into the background. He did not challenge authority openly. He did not react when insulted. He mastered the art of appearing compliant while remaining mentally alert. This was not submission, it was camouflage. The plantation rewarded obedience, but it underestimated observation. Domingo observed everything. Labor became a language of its own. The repetitive motion of cutting, lifting, carrying, and digging carved rhythm into his muscles. At first, the work felt endless, designed to grind thought into nothingness. But Domingo refused to let his mind rot. He used the repetition as cover, allowing his thoughts to roam even as his body moved automatically. He counted steps between posts. He measured time by shadows. He memorized which guards lingered and which hurried, which took pleasure in cruelty and which simply followed orders. Every detail mattered. On a battlefield without weapons, knowledge was the only advantage. Pain was constant. Blisters split open and bled. Muscles burned beyond fatigue. The sun pressed down like a physical weight, relentless and unforgiving. There were moments when Domingo felt his body sway, his vision narrowing, his strength threatening to abandon him. In those moments he returned to breath. Slow, controlled, deliberate. He remembered training exercises from his youth, moments when endurance mattered more than speed. He told himself that pain was temporary, but information was permanent. As long as he was conscious, he was learning. At night, the plantation transformed into something quieter, but no less dangerous. The absence of movement did not mean the absence of control. Guards still patrolled, dogs still listened. Domingo learned to sleep lightly, waking at the slightest change in sound. Dreams offered no rest. They dragged him back into the past, into fire, into chains, into the rolling darkness of the ocean. Sometimes he woke with his teeth clenched so tightly his jaw ached. Sometimes he woke drenched in sweat, his heart racing as if the raid were happening all over again. He learned to accept this too. Sleep, like freedom, would have to wait. There were others like him, men and women, who had not yet been broken, whose eyes still held something defiant. Domingo noticed them immediately. He did not approach them directly. Trust was dangerous here. Words traveled. Hope could be weaponized. Instead, he watched how they worked, how they reacted under pressure, how they responded to injustice. He noticed who shared food quietly, who helped the weak without drawing attention, who endured punishment without pleading. These were not signs of recklessness, they were signs of inner strength. Domingo stored their faces in his memory. The plantation attempted to erase individuality through routine. Everyone rose together. Everyone worked together. Everyone suffered together. But Domingo saw how suffering affected people differently. Some shrank inward, becoming invisible even to themselves. Others grew volatile, lashing out in ways that only hastened their destruction. A few, very few, became something else entirely. They grew quiet, focused, patient. Domingo recognized that patience. It mirrored his own. Punishments were public, calculated displays meant to reinforce fear. When someone attempted escape, their failure was announced through violence. Domingo witnessed men beaten until they could not stand, women whipped until their backs split open. He forced himself to watch, even when every instinct screamed to look away. He understood the purpose of the spectacle. Fear thrived in ignorance. Knowledge, even of cruelty, was power. He memorized the methods, the timing, the limits of what the overseers were willing to do. Cruelty followed patterns too. One afternoon, while hauling tools back to storage, Domingo noticed something small but significant. A section of fencing near the edge of the property sagged slightly, the wood weakened by rotten neglect. It was not enough to allow escape, not yet, but it was a flaw. A flaw meant possibility. Domingo did not stare, he did not slow. He passed by as if it were nothing, but the image burned itself into his mind. Flaws were the beginning of every collapse. The overseers began to rely on him more. His strength and consistency made him useful. He was trusted with heavier loads, longer hours, tasks that required moving between different sections of the plantation. With that trust came access. He saw more. He heard more. He learned where supplies were kept, where weapons were stored, where guards congregated during breaks. He learned which paths were used regularly and which were avoided. Every piece of information fit together slowly, like a map forming in his mind. Still, he did nothing. Not yet. The urge to act surged within him daily, a constant pressure against restraint. Every act of cruelty felt like an invitation to violence. Every scream felt like a command to strike. But Domingo remembered the ocean. He remembered how quickly impulsive resistance died in the hold of the ship. Without strategy led only to more bodies. If he was going to fight back, it would not be as a boy swinging blindly. It would be as a hunter choosing the moment. He trained his body in subtle ways. When lifting, he adjusted his grip to strengthen his hands. When walking, he practiced silent steps. When resting, he stretched muscles, carefully maintaining flexibility despite exhaustion. These were small acts, invisible to anyone watching, but together they rebuilt him, not into who he had been, but into who he needed to become. Language slowly came to him. Words used by overseers, commands shouted across fields, insults thrown casually. Domingo listened, repeating them silently until their meaning became clear. Understanding language meant anticipating intent. It meant knowing when danger was coming before it arrived. He did not speak unless necessary. When he did, he kept his voice neutral, his responses brief. Silence protected him. There were moments when doubt crept in, when the weight of endless days threatened to crush him. He wondered if escape was even possible, if the world beyond the plantation offered anything but more suffering. He wondered if resistance mattered in a system so vast, so well established. In those moments, he returned to memory. He remembered the kingdom of Kongo not as it was destroyed, but as it existed before the fire. He remembered elders speaking of endurance, of survival as resistance. He reminded himself that existence itself was an act of defiance. One night a storm rolled in, suddenly violent and loud. Rain hammered the roofs. Wind tore through the fields. Guards retreated to shelter, their vigilance dulled by discomfort. The plantation felt briefly unguarded, exposed. Domingo stood beneath the rain, letting it wash over him, masking sound, masking movement. For a heartbeat he considered running. The darkness beckoned. The forest beyond the fields whispered possibility. He did not move. He was not ready. That decision hurt more than any whip. Every part of him screamed to take the chance, to disappear into the storm and trust fate. But Domingo understood something now that he had not before. Survival alone was not enough. If he escaped alone, the system would remain intact. The plantation would continue. The chains would remain. He did not yet know how, but he felt deep within himself that his path was not meant to end with a single act of escape. Something larger was forming, something that required patience beyond comfort. Days bled into weeks. Weeks into months. Domingo's body bore the marks of his captivity scars, calluses, lines carved by exhaustion. But his spirit did not shrink. It sharpened. The plantation believed it was stripping him down. In truth, it was forging him into something harder than they understood. He began to notice fear among the overseers, not fear of rebellion, but fear of loss of control. Small disruptions unsettled them. Tools going missing. Animals behaving strangely. Sounds in the night they could not explain. Domingo did not cause these things, but he observed how quickly authority trembled when certainty faltered. Control depended on predictability. Break the pattern, and fear followed. The plantation was meant to be a place of endings. It ended names, it ended freedom, it ended hope. But for Domingo, it became something else entirely. It became a classroom, a proving ground, a crucible where suffering refined purpose. He was still enslaved, still bound by chains and commands, but he was not broken. The ocean had not claimed him. The plantation would not either. What they could not see, what they could never understand, was that every day Domingo endured was another day he learned how to dismantle the world they had built around him. Slowly, quietly, patiently, the boy from Kongo was gone. In his place stood a man who remembered everything. And memory, when sharpened by pain, becomes a weapon. The moment did not arrive with certainty. It arrived with pressure. Pressure built slowly day after day until the weight of remaining became heavier than the risk of leaving. Domingo felt it in his chest before he understood it with his mind. The plantation's routines no longer felt merely oppressive, they felt predictable. And predictability, he had learned, was a weakness. The overseers believed they had shaped him into a tool strong, quiet, reliable. That belief blinded them. They did not see how his movements had become deliberate, how his silences had grown intentional, how his patience had hardened into resolve. The night he chose was not dramatic. There was no storm to mask his departure, no chaos to distract attention. It was an ordinary night, and that was precisely why it worked. Ordinary nights bred complacency. Guards followed routine without thought. Dogs were fed, tethered, expected to bark at the unfamiliar. Domingo had learned their patterns too. He had learned when they slept deepest, when hunger dulled their senses, when exhaustion softened vigilance. He waited until the plantation exhaled, until the space between commands grew wide enough to slip through. He did not run at first. Running announced intention. Instead, he moved as he always did, slow, measured, unremarkable. He carried a tool he was expected to return to storage. No one questioned him. No one looked twice. The final chain he removed was not iron but habit. When he reached the edge of the property, where fields gave way to wild growth, he paused, not in fear but in respect. This was a threshold. Beyond it lay uncertainty, danger, and possibility. He took one breath, then another, grounding himself in the present. Then he stepped into the darkness. The forest swallowed him quickly. Sounds shifted. The open hush of fields gave way to layered noise, leaves whispering, insects humming, distant calls echoing through trees. Domingo slowed his breathing,
Not while I breathe!
letting his body remember what it once knew. This was not the forest of his childhood, but forests shared certain truths. Paths revealed themselves to those who listened. Danger announced itself before it struck. Domingo moved carefully, choosing each step with intention, placing his feet where the earth would not betray him. Behind him, the plantation slept, unaware that something had slipped through its grasp. Ahead of him, the night stretched long and unforgiving. Hunger gnawed at him. Fatigue pulled at his muscles, but adrenaline carried him forward, sharp and focused. He did not know where he was going. He only knew where he could not stay. By dawn, the plantation realized what had happened. Escape was rare, but not unheard of. What unsettled them was not the escape itself, it was how clean it had been. No alarms raised. No bodies found, no signs of panic. Domingo's absence felt deliberate, controlled. That unsettled the overseers more than any act of violence could have. They organized a search quickly, sending men trained to hunt humans through the woods, confident in their numbers and weapons. They had done this before. They believed they would do it again. Domingo felt the pursuit before he saw it. The forest changed subtly. Birds took flight too suddenly. Small animals scattered. The air itself seemed to tighten. He adjusted course instinctively, doubling back, wading through shallow water to erase his scent, climbing rocky ground that would slow pursuit. These were not tricks learned on the plantation. These were instincts awakened from memory, from a life lived before chains. His body remembered even when his mind doubted. The first tracker came too close too quickly. Domingo heard him before he saw him. Heavy steps, careless breathing, the confidence of a man who believed the hunt already won. Domingo crouched behind dense brush, heart steady, muscles coiled. He did not plan to kill, not yet. Killing would escalate everything. Instead, he waited until the man passed, then struck from behind with precision born of desperation and training. The blow stunned, not fatal. Domingo took what he needed: food, a knife, knowledge, and vanished before the man regained his senses. That encounter changed something fundamental. For the first time since his capture, Domingo was not reacting. He was acting. The shift was subtle but profound. He was no longer simply fleeing, he was navigating, choosing, adapting. The forest was no longer just a place to hide. It was a partner. The search intensified. More men entered the woods, moving in coordinated patterns, calling to one another, confident that numbers and firearms guaranteed success. Domingo watched them from a distance, noting their formations, their assumptions. They moved as if the forest belonged to them, that arrogance would become their undoing. Forests did not belong to anyone. They tolerated, then punished. Days passed in fragments. Domingo moved mostly at night, resting briefly during the day in concealed locations. He rationed food carefully, drank from streams, avoided leaving traces. His body screamed for rest, but his mind remained alert. Each encounter sharpened him further. Each narrow escape reinforced his understanding of his pursuers. They relied on speed and force. He relied on patience and terrain. It was not an even contest, but it was not the contest they believed they were fighting. One night, a hunter separated from the group, his confidence outweighing his caution. Domingo observed him for hours, learning his habits, waiting for the right moment. When he struck, it was swift and final. There was no anger in the act, no pleasure. Only necessity. The man would not hunt again. Domingo took his weapon, unfamiliar but powerful, and studied it carefully. Knowledge turned fear into utility. Word spread quickly among the hunters. This was no ordinary runaway. This was someone who knew how to move, how to strike, how to disappear. The tone of their voices changed. Confidence gave way to irritation, then unease. They began traveling in tighter groups, speaking less, listening more. Fear crept in, subtle but undeniable. Domingo felt the shift and adjusted accordingly. He no longer avoided encounters entirely. He chose them. He began to see the pursuit not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Every hunter carried supplies. Every hunter represented a weakening of the system that had enslaved him. The forest became a place of inversion, where the hunted dictated terms. He learned to anticipate their movements, to guide them unknowingly into difficult terrain. He used sound to mislead, traces to confuse, Sometimes he allowed himself to be seen briefly, just enough to draw them in the wrong direction. Panic made men careless. Carelessness made them vulnerable. As days turned into weeks, stories began to circulate beyond the plantation. Hunters went missing. Search parties returned shaken or not at all. The forest earned a reputation as cursed, hostile, unwilling to give up what it had claimed. Domingo listened from the shadows as fear grew, feeding on itself. He did not need to spread rumors. Fear wrote its own stories. He encountered others in the forest, runaways, fugitives, people who had fled different plantations and survived by hiding, scavenging, enduring. At first, trust was fragile. They watched each other cautiously, all too aware of the cost of betrayal. But shared danger built fragile alliances. Domingo shared what he knew. In return, he learned of routes, safe places, communities hidden deeper within the wilderness. Resistance was not isolated. It was scattered, fragmented but real. The shift from escape to hunt was not a single moment. It was a gradual realization. Domingo understood one night, as he watched a group of hunters retreat in fear, that he was no longer simply avoiding capture. He was shaping events. His actions had consequences beyond his own survival. The system that had treated him as property was now reacting to him as a threat. This realization carried weight. With it came responsibility. Every action could invite retaliation against those still enslaved. Domingo weighed each decision carefully, balancing vengeance against consequence. He did not strike blindly. He chose targets that weakened the hunt without provoking indiscriminate punishment. This restraint distinguished him from the violence that had birthed his captivity. He refused to become what he hated. Still, there were moments when rage threatened to overtake him. When memories of the ship, the plantation, the punishment surged back with unbearable clarity. In those moments, he returned to discipline. Rage was fuel, not direction. He let it sharpen his focus, not cloud it. The forest became his domain. He learned its moods, its seasons, its hidden paths. He learned where it offered protection and where it demanded caution. His movements grew fluid, confident. The boy who had once trained in Kongo would have recognized the posture, the awareness. The man he had become was something new, shaped by loss, forged by endurance. By the time the plantation abandoned the search, Domingo had already moved beyond their reach. Fear outweighed profit. No one wanted to be the next name whispered in warning. The system adjusted, retreating from areas it could no longer control. That retreat was small, almost invisible on a map. But to those who lived under its shadow, it meant something profound. It meant the illusion of absolute power had cracked. Domingo did not celebrate. Victory felt complicated. There was no joy in death, no satisfaction in fear. But there was purpose. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He was no longer just a survivor of the slave trade. He was a force it had failed to contain. The escape had not ended his story. It had begun it anew. The boy enslaved at 16 was gone. In his place stood a hunter who understood the value of patience, the cost of violence, and the power of memory. And the forest, once a place of hiding, had become a place of reckoning. The forest did not announce Domingo as transformation, but it bore witness to it. Where once he had moved through the trees as a fugitive, now he moved as something else, entirely deliberate, composed, and aware of the effect his presence had begun to create. Fear lingered in the places he passed through, not because he sought it, but because fear followed disruption. The system that had enslaved him depended on certainty, certainty that escape would be punished, certainty that resistance would be crushed, certainty that those who hunted would always return. Domingo's survival shattered that certainty. His continued presence deep within the wilderness fractured it further. And as uncertainty spread, it began to take on a shape that men could name only in whispers. The hunters who still dared to enter the forest spoke differently now. Their voices were lower, their jokes gone. Confidence had been replaced by vigilance, and vigilance by dread. They told stories to explain what they could not control, stories of a shadow that moved without sound, of traps that appeared where no traps should be, of a presence that watched without being seen. Domingo heard these stories secondhand, from runaways and wanderers who crossed his path. He did not correct them. Myths served a purpose. Myths traveled faster than truth. Domingo understood something vital at this stage of his journey. Revenge did not always require spectacle. Loud violence drew attention, and attention brought retaliation. The kind of revenge that lasted was quiet, methodical, and selective. He did not attack plantations indiscriminately. He did not burn fields or slaughter guards in fits of rage. Instead, He targeted the arteries of the system, the hunters, the trackers, the men whose profession depended on returning people to chains. Without them, the plantations felt exposed. Without them, fear shifted direction. Each encounter followed careful preparation. Domingo observed first, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. He learned routes, habits, weaknesses. He chose locations where terrain favored him and escape routes were plentiful. He struck when certainty was highest because certainty bred carelessness. These were not battles in the traditional sense. There were no lines drawn, no declarations made. There were only moments where men realized too late that they were no longer in control. Not every encounter ended in death. Domingo was not driven by bloodlust. Sometimes disarming a hunter and leaving him alive was more effective than killing him. Survivors carried fear back with them. Survivors spread stories. Survivors hesitated the next time they were ordered into the forest. Fear multiplied itself without Domingo lifting another hand. Word traveled beyond individual plantations. Traders altered routes. Patrols were delayed or cancelled altogether. Entire stretches of land were quietly marked as dangerous, avoided whenever possible. Official records did not reflect these changes. Ledgers remained neat, confident, assured. But reality moved beneath the surface, unseen by those who trusted paper more than people. Domingo became aware of how his actions rippled outward. Runaways found refuge areas previously considered too risky. Small, hidden communities began to form, temporary at first, then slowly more permanent. People shared food, knowledge, warnings. They spoke of a protector, though Domingo never claimed that title. Protection implied authority. He did not want authority. He wanted disruption. In these communities, Domingo saw reflections of his past. People who had lost families, names, futures, people who carried grief like a second skin. He did not promise them safety. He did not promise victory. He shared what he knew and left the rest to choice. Survival, he had learned, was most powerful when it remained voluntary. As his reputation grew, so did the danger. Slave traders and plantation owners did not tolerate threats lightly. They offered rewards for information, for capture, for proof of death. Men eager for profit or recognition began searching for him specifically. Domingo adjusted again. He changed patterns, moved more frequently, trusted fewer people. Fame was dangerous. Legend protected him from the ignorant, but it attracted the ambitious. There were nights when exhaustion pressed down so heavily that he questioned how long he could continue. His body bore the cost of constant movement, of wounds treated hastily, of rest taken in fragments. Age crept in faster under these conditions. Domingo felt it in his joints, in the way cold nights bit deeper than before. But he also felt something else, a sense of purpose that anchored him more firmly than youth ever had. Revenge, he discovered, was not a single act. It was a process, a dismantling. It required patience greater than anger. Every hunter who failed to return, every route abandoned, every rumor that spread further weakened the machinery that had once seemed invincible. Domingo did not delude himself into believing he could destroy the entire system alone. That was not his goal. Systems collapsed slowly from pressure applied at their weakest points. He was pressure. Occasionally he encountered men who reminded him of himself, not in position but in mindset. Young hunters, confident, untested, convinced of their superiority. In them, Domingo saw the danger of ignorance. Some he frightened away. Some he disarmed and humiliated. A few he killed when there was no other choice. Each decision weighed on him differently. He carried those weights silently, storing them where grief and resolve mingled. The absence of official records became its own form of erasure. Domingo's actions were too inconvenient to document. Acknowledging him meant acknowledging vulnerability, and vulnerability threatened the narrative of control. So his story lived in rumor instead, in half-remembered warnings and instructions whispered to new recruits. Do not go there. Do not go alone. Do not chase too far. In that silence, Domingo existed between history and myth. He was neither fully one nor the other. He understood that this invisibility was a double-edged blade. It protected him from targeted annihilation, but it also ensured that his story would not be preserved in the way others were. There would be no monuments, no official recognition, no place in textbooks. He accepted this with a quiet bitterness. Survival, he knew, did not guarantee remembrance, yet remembrance took other forms. Children in hidden communities grew up hearing of a man who walked the forest like it was alive, who knew how to vanish when danger approached, who punished those who hunted the helpless. The details changed with each telling. The core remained. Resistance had a face, even if no one could describe it clearly. Domingo grew older within this rhythm of movement and consequence. Seasons passed, marked by shifting leaves and changing weather. He adapted continually, never allowing routine to dull his edge. He taught when he could how to read signs, how to move quietly, how to survive without drawing attention. Teaching was another form of revenge. Knowledge, once spread, could not be recaptured. There were moments of quiet, too. Rare, fragile moments where Domingo sat alone and allowed himself to feel the weight of everything he had lost. In those moments, the memories returned with painful clarity, He wondered what his life might have been that way he never come. He wondered who he would have become without chains shaping his path. These questions had no answers. He let them pass. What mattered was what he had become, not a symbol crafted for inspiration, but a man shaped by reality, making choices within constraints, refusing to surrender agency even when stripped of everything else. His revenge was not a blaze of destruction. It was erosion, slow, relentless, unavoidable. The slave hunters adapted as well, of course, they always did. They traveled in larger groups, avoided certain terrains, relied more heavily on informants. The system did not collapse overnight. It resisted, shifted, persisted. Domingo accepted this. He did not seek finality. He sought impact. As years passed, his presence became less frequent, but no less influential. He appeared when needed, disappeared when necessary. Some believed he had died. Others believed he was many men rather than one. Domingo did nothing to correct these assumptions. Ambiguity was protection. Let them fear the unknown. In time, the forest reclaimed much of what it had witnessed. Paths changed. Trees fell and regrew. Evidence vanished. Domingo's footprints faded as surely as anyone else. The physical traces of his actions dissolved into the landscape. What remained was memory, unreliable, shifting but persistent. This was the revenge no one recorded. Not because it did not matter, but because it threatened too much. It exposed cracks in a system that relied on the illusion of total control. It proved that even within one of the most brutal structures ever built, resistance could take root, adapt, and endure. Domingo did not see himself as victorious. Victory implied an end. His life did not offer that simplicity. But he understood something equally important. He had refused to disappear quietly. He had forced the world to react to him, even if it refused to name him. And in that refusal, quiet, sustained, uncompromising, his revenge lived on. There was no final battle that marked Domingo's end. No decisive confrontation where the forest echoed with gunfire or blood soaked into the earth as proof. His disappearance did not arrive with spectacle, because spectacle was never his way. Instead, it came quietly, almost imperceptibly, the same way he had learned to move through the world. One season he was spoken of in hushed warnings, his name carried cautiously between hunters and traders. The next, he became uncertain. Then, slowly, he became past tense. At first, no one believed he was gone. Absence had always been part of his strategy. He vanished and returned so often that silence itself became familiar. When weeks passed without sightings, people assumed he was watching from deeper within the forest, waiting, measuring. When months passed, they said he had moved further away, following new threats, new routes. Even the hunters, hardened by years of pursuit, refused to speak his name with confidence. To declare him gone felt dangerous, like tempting fate. Fear lingered long after evidence faded. But time has a way of eroding even the strongest legends. Routes once avoided were slowly tested again. Patrols ventured deeper into the woods, cautiously at first, then with growing boldness. When no punishment followed, confidence crept back in. The system, always adaptive, began to stretch itself outward once more, probing the boundaries Domingo had forced it to respect. To the outside world, it seemed as if the forest had finally surrendered its secret. Inside the hidden communities, the conversation was different. People noticed the change immediately. They noticed how warnings stopped arriving, how paths once guarded by rumor felt suddenly exposed. Some believed Domingo had finally escaped beyond reach, perhaps finding a place where he could rest, where survival no longer demanded constant movement. Others believed he had fallen killed in some forgotten skirmish, claimed by sickness or injury, his body reclaimed by the land that had protected him for so long. No one knew. And that uncertainty became its own burden. Domingo had lived so long without permanence that permanence itself became foreign. Years of vigilance had trained his body to expect danger at every turn. Even moments of calm carried tension, like the stillness before a storm. If he did slow down, if he did finally stop moving, it was not because the world had grown safer. It was because his body had grown tired in ways willpower could no longer override. Wounds healed slower. Cold lingered longer in his bones. Hunger cut deeper than it once had. These were not defeats. They were reminders that even resistance had a cost. If Domingo sensed the end approaching, he left no record of it. No final message, no declaration of victory or failure. That, too, was intentional. Records could be captured, words could be twisted. Silence could not be controlled. By leaving nothing behind, he denied his enemies the satisfaction of closure that could never be certain. And uncertainty, he knew, was the enemy of control. Some said they saw him one last time, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching a patrol pass without interference, his posture calm, almost reflective. Others claimed he appeared to a group of runaways, offering guidance without explanation, then disappearing before dawn. These stories conflicted, overlapped, contradicted one another. Truth dissolved into memory. Memory dissolved into myth. What remained undeniable was the absence itself. Without Domingo's presence, the forest felt different. Not quieter but altered, as if something essential had been removed. People who had relied on the protection of rumor and fear now had to rely on each other more directly. The skills he had shared became more valuable than ever. Knowledge replaced legend. In that way, his disappearance forced others to step forward rather than wait for salvation. For the slave hunters and traders, the uncertainty never fully lifted. Even years later, new recruits were warned about certain places, certain routes that had a history of not returning men. They were told stories passed down from older hunters, stories that had lost names but not meaning. Something happened there, they would say. Men vanished. The explanation was always vague, always unsatisfying, but fear does not require detail, it only requires memory. Domingo's disappearance also marked the beginning of erasure. Official documents never acknowledged him. Plantation records continued as if nothing had ever disrupted their order. Losses were attributed to disease, misfortune, accidents. The system rewrote reality to preserve its illusion of control. To admit that one enslaved boy had destabilized entire regions through persistence alone would have been unacceptable. So history closed its eyes. But history is not only written by ink. It is carried in bodies, in habits, in the way people move differently after danger has passed. The changes Domingo forced did not vanish with him. Patrols remained cautious. Routes remained altered. The fear he introduced never fully dissolved. Like a scar beneath clothing, it was hidden but permanent. In the quiet that followed, Domingo's story transformed. Without new actions to anchor it, imagination filled the gaps. Some believed he had never been a single man at all, but a name used by many runaways, a shared identity passed between resistors. Others believed he had become part of the forest itself, a presence rather than a person. These interpretations said more about the storytellers than about Domingo. People shape legends according to what they need. What they needed most was proof that resistance was possible, even if temporary, even if incomplete. For those who had known him directly, those who had shared food, warnings, strategies, the silence carried a different weight. They understood that Domingo had never wanted to be remembered as a hero. He had wanted impact, not recognition. His disappearance felt like a final lesson. Survival could not depend on one figure forever. Systems survived by replacing individuals. Resistance had to do the same. And so, life continued. New runaways fled into the forest. New hunters were trained to retrieve them. The cycle persisted, though never quite the same. Something had shifted permanently, even if it could not be measured. The illusion of total dominance had been broken once, and once broken, it could never be fully restored. If Domingo died, he died as he lived, unclaimed, unrecorded, unknown. If he escaped beyond the reach of his pursuers, he did so without leaving a trail, dissolving into anonymity by choice. Either outcome denied the system what it valued most, certainty. His final act of resistance was not violence, but absence. In that absence, the forest remained. It held no monuments, no markers to declare what it had sheltered. Trees grew where footsteps once fell. Rain washed away blood. Time did what time always does, it covered evidence. But the land remembered in its own way. Places where men once vanished retained a reputation. Even generations later, hesitation lingered. Domingo's disappearance reminds us of something uncomfortable. History favors conclusions. It prefers clear endings, decisive victories, definitive deaths. But real resistance rarely offers such simplicity. It fades, shifts, transforms. It leaves behind questions rather than answers, and those questions can be more dangerous than any recorded fact. The boy taken from Kongo did not return home. The man forged by captivity did not reclaim the world he lost. But between those two truths exists a life that refused erasure, even when history tried to enforce it. Domingo's disappearance was not failure. It was continuation passed on through memory, caution, and changed behavior. Silence followed him. But silence, too, can speak. Silence followed Domingo, but silence did not erase him, because what he had done could not be undone, and what he had awakened could not be put back to sleep. Long after his footsteps vanished from the forest floor, long after his name stopped being whispered with certainty, the consequences of his resistance continued to ripple outward in ways that even the most powerful systems could not fully control. Fear had once belonged only to the enslaved, carefully cultivated through violence, separation, and despair, but Domingo had reversed its direction, and once fear changed sides, it never fully returned to its original owner. The hunters remembered that reversal in their bones, even if they pretended not to. They remembered how certainty dissolved, how control weakened, how the forest itself seemed to reject them. And memory, even unspoken, is a form of inheritance. As years turned into decades, the world reshaped itself around new languages, new borders, new powers, but the foundation of exploitation remained disturbingly familiar. The transatlantic slave trade eventually declined, then ended in name, but its echoes lived on in labor systems, racial hierarchies, and economic structures that quietly carried the same logic forward. Domingo did not live to see these transformations, but his story belongs to them nonetheless, because resistance is not measured by what it defeats completely, but by what it interrupts. He interrupted inevitability. He proved that domination was not natural, not absolute, and not immune to challenge, even from a single boy stripped of everything but his will. In oral traditions, Domingo's story shifted shape, adapting to the needs of those who told it. In some versions, he became many men. In others, he became an idea rather than a person. That transformation was not delusion, it was survival. Stories that cling too tightly to specifics are easier to erase. Stories that evolve endure. What mattered was not the exact number of hunters he stopped, or the precise locations of his actions, but the truth beneath them, that resistance did not require armies, wealth, or permission. It required resolve, awareness, and the refusal to accept the lie that suffering was destiny. Generations born into bondage or its aftermath inherited a world already shaped by invisible defiance. They inherited paths altered by fear, systems forced to adapt, and rules quietly rewritten because someone like Domingo had made the old ones unsafe. Even those who never heard his name benefited from the cracks he created. Every delayed patrol, every abandoned route, every moment of hesitation traced back to him, whether acknowledged or not. History often credits change to laws and leaders, but it is individuals in the shadows who weaken systems enough for collapse to become possible. The tragedy of Domingo's story is not that it ended in uncertainty, but that it was never meant to be remembered at all. The machinery of oppression depends on selective memory. It elevates compliance and erases defiance. It documents profits and buries pain. That Domingo's story survives at all is an act of rebellion against that machinery. To tell it now is to refuse the silence that was meant to consume him. It is to insist that the lives deemed disposable were in fact decisive. Domingo was not born a symbol. He became one through circumstance and choice. He did not set out to change history. He set out to survive with dignity in a world designed to strip him of it. That distinction matters because it reminds us that resistance is not always grand or planned. Sometimes it begins as refusal to submit, refusal to forget who you are, refusal to accept the role assigned to you. From that refusal, action grows. From action, consequence. From consequence, legacy. Even now, centuries later, the discomfort his story creates is telling. It unsettles narratives that prefer passive suffering over active resistance. It complicates the idea that freedom was granted rather than fought for. It forces us to confront the truth that violence did not flow in only one direction, and that when it flowed back, it did so not out of savagery but out of necessity. Domingo's actions were not born of cruelty. They were born of clarity. He understood that the system hunting him would never stop unless it was made to fear the cost. The forest that once hid him no longer exists in the same form. Lands have been cleared, borders drawn, histories rewritten. But resistance does not require the same geography to survive. It adapts, just as Domingo did. Today it lives in memory, in scholarship, in storytelling, in the quiet insistence that the past be examined honestly rather than comfortably. Every time a forgotten story is told, the silence imposed by power is broken again. Domingo's life also forces us to question how we measure victory. He did not dismantle slavery. He did not return home in triumph. He did not live long enough to see the world change. By conventional standards, his impact might seem limited, but those standards are shaped by the very systems he resisted. Real victory in contexts like his is survival with agency. It is disruption. It is the refusal to disappear quietly. By that measure, Domingo won every day he lived on his own terms. There is a temptation to romanticize figures like Domingo, to turn them into mythic heroes untouched by fear or doubt. That temptation does him a disservice. His courage mattered precisely because fear existed. His resolve mattered because surrender was always an option. He was not extraordinary because he lacked vulnerability. He was extraordinary because he acted despite it. Remembering that keeps his story human, and humanity is where its power truly lies. As we reach the end of this story, we are left not with closure but with responsibility. To hear Domingo's story and move on unchanged would be to repeat the silence history intended for him. To engage with it, to sit with its discomfort, its ambiguity, its unfinished nature is to honor the resistance it represents. Stories like this are not entertainment alone. They are mirrors. They ask us what we would do under similar pressure and what systems today still rely on silence to survive. Domingo's name may never appear in official textbooks. His face may never be reconstructed. His exact fate may remain unknown. But his impact exists in every moment where power was questioned, where fear changed direction, where the oppressed refused to remain invisible. That is not a small legacy. That is a lasting one. And now, as this chapter closes, the story does not truly end. It moves forward through those who hear it, remember it, and share it. If this story held you, if it made you pause, reflect, or see history differently, then Domingo's resistance continues through you. Before you go, subscribe to the Black Timeline, tap the bell icon so you never miss another untold story, and leave a comment sharing how this story made you feel and how deeply it impacted you. These stories survive because they are heard and remembered.